Okay, great. Okay. Welcome, comrades, to the Relaunch Decolonization of Science Reading Club. So this is the first session that we have that we're having. It's usually the same first session that we had in 2019, which was unpacking exactly what does it mean to decolonize science. This new Decolonization of Science Reading Club is now being done by the Wits Science Faculty Council in collaboration with the Wits Students Bioethics Society, was incubated by the Wits School of Physics Council in 2019. And so there are resources that will draw on from the 2019 council. So in addressing the question of what does it mean to decolonize science, so the question is, why are we having this discussion to begin with, right? Where does the motivation come for asking the question of decolonizing science? So just why we started the reading club in the beginning. So when I put out this on social media yesterday, when I put out our poster, it took about 15 minutes before someone dropped the Science Must Fall video in the replies to the tweets. And I think that that's a very, very simplistic caricature of what decolonizing science means. And a critique of Western modernity is one thing, but then extending that critique of Western modernity to the extent that you would scrap the totality of science in order for epistemically to start from scratch is, I think, very misguided. And it's not just my opinion. Obviously, this is something that is held by particularly Dr. Chandra Prescott-Weinstein, whose reading list and article is the primary resource for today. So the other reason was building consciousness around the idea that science is political. And I think that's really, really important, that science doesn't exist separately from the society in which it is conducted. Then the other one was the telling of the history, untainted by Eurocentric whitewashing, as a means of dispelling the lies peddled by white supremacists. And I'll get into this a little bit more when we speak the history of the whitewashing of scientific history. The other one is decolonizing science as a reclamation project. So usually it's seen, and there is this misperception, and I think it's very, I think it's in some sense self-sabotage as people of the global South to concede science, which I think is one of the grandest epistemic traditions in human history, to white Europeans, to allow for this lie that science is European to be perpetuated. And so the decolonial project is about making asserting in direct opposition to the idea that science is European, that it belongs to all of us, particularly those of us in formerly colonized nations and those of us in the global South. Then the reading club, specifically why a reading club? And so reading provides us with the theory to conceptualize colonialism and neocolonialism, and that then equips us with the means to dismantle those systems of subjugation, supremacy, and theft, both inside and outside of science. And so it's part of the program of decolonizing science is engaging the readings. And yeah, I think that reading very much is revolutionary. And so that was the motivations for the founding of the Reading Club in 2019. And those same motivations drive us now. I think what's changed is that we are now coming out of a wave of protests for free, equality, decolonized education. And so the question of decolonization inside of our institutions has become one that is far more spoken about than it was in 2019 when this was first an issue. So to get on then to moving to the decolonial project more generally, and the decolonization of our institutions and knowledge more generally. So the thesis is that knowledge does not exist in silos. And so science is no specific case, no special case. And because science is intertwined with other forms of knowledge, there's insight to be gained concerning the project of decolonizing science at these epistemic intersections. And so when we're looking at decolonizing science, it is impossible for us to just look at science, as in there's always this thing of, and it really is a really great testimony, I think, to why science students should do humanities courses. When you get questions like, if you want to decolonize science, then how do you decolonize gravity? And it's never been about that. It's never been about, looking at the equations and asking ourselves, how do we decolonize Newton too? It's about looking at the world around those equations in order to understand the place that science plays in society and the place that knowledge played in the development of technology, in the development of society. And so that's the basic idea. And so this is from this quote is from Dr. Chandra Prescott Weinstein's reading list, and she takes a very similar approach. You'll find texts that range from personal testimony to indigenous cosmology, to anthropology, to history, to sociology, to education research. All are key to the process of decolonizing science, which is a pedagogical, cultural, and intellectual set of interlocking structures, ideas, and practices. This reading list functions on the premise that there is value in considering the ways in which science and society co-construct. It is stuff that I have read all or part of and saw some value in sharing with others. So the project of decolonizing science then is linked to the project of decolonization in every faculty of teaching and learning at our institutions. And the project of decolonization in every other faculty of teaching and learning is linked to the project of decolonizing science. I don't think these are separable because of the fact that, knowledge is not distinctly separated, from field to field. These are ultimately artificial constraints that or artificial barriers that we create between different types of knowledge. So that's the decolonial project on more broadly at the institution. Then the broader decolonial project in terms of beyond just, institutions of higher learning, again starts with the thesis that science does not exist separately from the society in which it is conducted and is hence political. And so the way Dr. Chandra Prescott Weinstein puts that is science and society co-construct. And science interacts and converges with other forms of knowledge, what we've just spoken about, and thus other sectors of society through that. And so because of the fact that it takes place within the society, it is embedded within a dominant status quo of racism and white supremacy, of patriarchy, misogyny, and queerphobia, of colonialism and neocolonialism, and inside of the agenda of empire. So concerning these, just examples of how science and can be put inside of the dominant status quo, I have put together a couple of examples. And so the first one is the whitewashing of scientific history and the myth of the Dark Ages. So we have this whitewashed history of science that is ordinarily taught. The candle goes out in Europe, everything goes dark, and then one day Descartes has some thoughts and everything starts again. And that's the one that's ordinarily taught, and it does feed into a racist notion of European intellectual superiority, the idea that Europe owns science, and it perpetuates the idea that science belonged to Europe and North America. So, and controlling the history and controlling the narrative is very important in controlling the scientific space, and that's what's happened. And so I wrote, sometimes there's more to be learned about those who write the history from what they omit as opposed to what they write. And so here the agenda of white supremacy hides in those mysterious voids between the centuries, in those so-called Dark Ages. And so the truth of the matter is that when the candle of science died in Europe, when that flame died, it wasn't extinguished across the world. And that flame wasn't born in Europe either. Some of the foundations of mathematics, for example, Brahmagupta came with zero. The Hindu-Arabic numeral system laid the foundations. Al-Khwarizmi was responsible for algebra. There was a significant contribution to those sciences by non-Europeans. And so the candle was, it took flight away from Europe during the so-called Dark Ages. And so I did highlight the Islamic Golden Age, as a particular point. So looking at the Abbasids in particular in the center of learning in Baghdad, looking at Andalusia and the flowering of Andalusia that happened. And so this explosion. And so there is a book called Science and Islam, a History by Hassan Masood, who does lay this out. And this is in the period between when the Dark Ages were going on in Europe, before the Renaissance, before the Enlightenment. Subsequent to this period, there was it was passed back onto Europe. And so, and then very little to no credit was given to it, so that we do create this narrative that all of a sudden the Europeans had some ideas, which is not true. And so just to give an example, Al-Tusi was, I think he was the court astronomer for the grandson of Genghis Khan, Hulagu Khan. I'm not entirely sure, if I'm honest, but Al-Tusi was before Copernicus. And so he was in this period where the geocentric models of seeing our space in the cosmos were starting to falter, but becoming more and more and more sophisticated in order to account for the empirical evidence. And so Tusi was at the end point of this. And so he has this idea called the Tusi cap wall, which he writes down, and it's about, you imagine sort of a ball rolling inside of a barrel, and you keep track of like one point on the ball as it rolls. But basically this gave some insight into eventually what Copernicus used to formulate the heliocentric model, the big leap in decentering humanity and basically taming our conceits in many ways. So but when Copernicus took this information, he didn't credit Al-Tusi, and this wasn't uncommon. And so what I've written there is epistemic colonization. I'd like to discuss that term after this, like, you know, in terms of what communists think about that term, because I mean at university we just call it plagiarism, but I think there is a different dynamic here. So and then Europe gets it back, and they weaponize scientific knowledge. They use it as a claim to superiority. They pervert it insights, and they use it to drive machines of colonization, subjugation, and exploitation. And so I think the next one I went to was A Wretched History of Astronomy as a Tool of European Slavery and Colonization. So this is from Dr. Chandna Prescott Weinstein. And she's speaking about Huygens and Cassini and how they facilitated and directed astronomical observation missions in order to help the French better determine the location of Saint-Domingue, the island that houses the modern nations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Why? Because this would help make the delivery of slaves and export of the products of their labor more efficient. This is just one example which stuck out to me because I'm a descendant of the Caribbean part of the Atlantic slave trade, and I also have 2 degrees in astronomy and 2 in physics. So when it comes to this, I think what's really crucial, firstly, it's when you learn science and you learn about Huygens and Cassini, they never mention this at all. They make no attempt to historically contextualize any of the figures. And I'll give another example after this one. I mean, Cassini is the name of the probe around Saturn. So these are people who are celebrated and honored inside of science. And this part of their history, the role that they played, in this case, like chattel slavery, is just completely whitewashed. And so I think this is part of importantly complicating the narrative concerning science and the way in which it exists. And so that's astronomy as a tool of European slavery and colonization. Then to get to nuclear physics and quantum mechanics. So Werner Heisenberg is very well known for the uncertainty principle, placing fundamental limitations about how much we can know about the physical world. That's what you learn about him. And H. Balver too. You learn matrix mechanics. You learn all of these things and his contribution towards science. At no point does anybody even drop a footnote that he was a Nazi and that he was trying to build Hitler an atom bomb. And so there is this popular misconception, and there is an article about this that is on the drive, actually. I think it was published in the New York Times in the early 2000s about this misconception that Heisenberg attempted to sabotage the project of building a nuclear weapon for Hitler. And so Dr. Finn Azerud, who is the director of the Niels Bohr Archive in Copenhagen, said that he read a letter written but never sent from Bohr to Heisenberg. And so Niels Bohr was very much mortified by what Heisenberg became. Bohr was his early champion. And anyway, from the contents of this letter, though, Azerud said that Bohr does not mention any moral scruples or intention to sabotage the bomb project with the reason for Heisenberg's visit to Bohr. And so at no point is there any evidence that Heisenberg was actually trying to fail. He failed because he failed, and we can be very grateful that he did. But there is obviously this, post hoc attempt even to say that he failed on purpose. So that's nuclear physics, quantum mechanics, and the atom bomb, which I'll speak to a little in a bit. But before we get to that, so there are 4 examples I want to look at here. So Dr. Chanda Prescott-Weinstein has spoken about how, if you want to use her list as part of some decolonizing science project, then it shouldn't be an ivory tower exercise of just trying to understand it from a distance. We need to engage directly with combating what she calls the physicality of colonialism. That there's no intellectual colonialism without it being concretely enforced through material means by a ruling power. And so the 4 examples I have is the construction of the 30-meter telescope, right? And in response to that, direct action to protect Mauna Kea, Israeli universities built upon stolen Palestinian land, and the response to that being the academic boycott of apartheid Israeli institutions, the Manhattan Project, and the response to that being banning of the bomb, and then the statue of Cecil John Rhodes at UCT, and the response to that being Rhodes must fall. So I'm going to go through these on how they've all played out. So the 30-meter telescope in Hawaii is, they've been trying to build it since at least 2015, when the KIE for the first time blocked the construction of the telescope. And so they're trying to build the 30-meter telescope upon indigenous land in a conservation district. And, already on Mauna Kea in Hawaii, there are more than 10 telescopes, I'm quite sure. And so this is not just them saying, we don't want a telescope on our land. It's them saying we don't want another one on our land. And there hasn't been the seeking of informed consent from indigenous people about this. And it's brought up a really, really important conversation in astronomy and in physics about the rights of indigenous people, issues of land and astronomy. And so the TMT case is a case of where the scientific enterprise meets the colonial enterprise. And so we have a form of neo-colonialism under the pretense of scientific progress. In response to this, so in 2019, when we first started the Decolonization of Science Reading Club, they had undertaken direct action to prevent the construction. So they occupied the construction sites, they blocked the roads. Students at student staff, workers at the University of Hawaii went on strike in solidarity with the indigenous people at Mauna Kea. And so there was a huge push to stop the construction in 2019, which it did. At that point, there were funds. So there's fundraising. There actually still is funds to fundraising to support the indigenous people of Mauna Kea in fighting back against the degradation of their land. That link is in the statement that we put out. I will circulate it on our socials again, and that very much is what Dr. Chanda has spoken about, in that she said you can thank her for free labor in putting together the list and maintaining the list by donating to that fund. There also was another fund just to go into direct action to support people who are being brutalized and arrested by the police for protesting against the theft of their land. And obviously we know that there are parallels in those in police brutality in defense of colonialism. We see it now with the IDF, for example. Those rubber bullets that they shoot at us aren't rubber bullets, quote unquote, aren't very much removed from the bullets that they were shooting at us on Empire Road earlier this year. So we know that there are parallels there, obviously, with the police brutality, and so there was another fund that was set up to support people who were being arrested and so on. What's great here is, I mean, they took direct action, right? So the people of the KIA to protect Manama Wakia decided against, petition tactics, or they reached a point where they recognized that that would not work. Petitioning the mayor, petitioning the heads of universities and so on to try and get, bending the ear of the people in power to try and get them to do what you want. They decided that no, they're going to stop it themselves. And the thing is, it's working. So in order for the 30-meter telescope to go forward, it needs to get funding from the United States government. But the way in which projects are prioritized for funding requires a clear path to their construction, because of the fact that the KIA have been undertaking direct action to stop the construction of the 30-meter telescope. When they go and they set their priorities for funding, they'll take that into account and it will drop the TMT in terms of priorities for funding. And so if that funding doesn't come through, this 30-meter telescope will probably move to the Canary Islands and the KIA will have one. So I think this, in terms of tactic, is really crucial because it's direct action is, in all cases, very, very powerful. Shut it down. And they did shut it down, and they're still shutting it down. And so our solidarity is with them in fighting back against the degradation and theft of their land, and the land that their ancestors have stayed on for a very long time. So that's the 30-meter telescope. Then the second one is what next week's meeting will focus on, which is apartheid, Israeli institutions, and the academic boycott of Israel. So in terms of the role of Israeli institutions in Israeli apartheid, one, Israeli institutions conceptualize the ideologies that drive the murderous actions of the apartheid Zionist state. Two, Israeli institutions design the weaponry that executes the ruthless, murderous actions of the Zionist state. And three, Israeli institutions are party to the designing of surveillance technology to monitor, control, and spy on Palestinians. On the issue of weaponry and surveillance, obviously there is a nexus between, the academia and the weapons, the military-industrial complex in developing that. And I mean, it's really necessary to mention that Hewlett-Packard, HP, manufactures biometric surveillance technology that's used to enforce the blockade on Gaza, which is why it's a BDS target. So obviously this will be spoken to in a lot more depth next week. And I'd encourage everyone here to come to that. But the other thing is that they are built upon stolen Palestinian land. And so, for example, Tel Aviv University is built upon the ruins of Al-Sheikh Muannis, which is an ethnically cleansed Palestinian village. So there's definitely a lot to unpack there, a lot to substantiate in terms of what is meant by an academic boycott, the misperception that it's about cutting off ties between individual academics as opposed to cutting institutional ties. But we will get into all of that in a lot more detail when we speak about this next week. Then the Manhattan Project. So here, I mean, in the case of apartheid Israel, it's a very clear case of settler colonialism and apartheid. Here, when we're speaking about the Manhattan Project, it really is about where imperialism and the Cold War agenda of the United States meets colonialism and neocolonialism, particularly the colonialism of Belgium in the Congo. And so this I found interesting. So this was at a time when the nuclear arms race was just starting out. And August 1939, Einstein writes to FDR and he says, quote, "This new phenomenon would also lead to the construction of bombs, and it is conceivable, though much less certain, that extremely powerful bombs of this type may thus be constructed. A single bomb of this type carried by boat and exploded in a port might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. However, such bombs might very well prove too heavy for transportation by air. The United States has only very poor ores of uranium in moderate quantities. There is some good ore in Canada and former Czechoslovakia, while the most important source of uranium is in the Belgian Congo. So there are two things to note here. The first is that Einstein knew exactly how indiscriminate and dangerous these weapons were and how they could take out a whole port. And the second one was telling the president of the United States, look in Belgian Congo. So to go into the plea to FDR, it came out of a fear of Nazi Germany developing an atom bomb first. I can't actually remember where Einstein stood on that letter post, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but he does make two pleas to FDR. One, which was securing a supply of uranium ore for the United States, which we just saw. He spoke about Canada and former Czechoslovakia, but directly specifically spoke about, he called it Belgian Congo, Congo that was being colonized by Belgium. And the second part was increasing funding with the aim of accelerating experimental work on nuclear physics in the United States, which very much was seen as sort of green light from Einstein for the Manhattan Project, and which he never was directly a part of, but this letter does exist. So they did go to Congo. And so the uranium that was used to build the atomic bomb, the one that was dropped on Hiroshima, came from the Shinkolobwe mine in Congo's Katanga province. And so at this time, in the 40s, Congo was still a Belgian colony, right? And so June 1960, Patrice Lumumba, first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo, after independence, describes and condemns the humiliating bondage, racism, and systematic subjugation that was innate in the Belgian colonial project. And so this was entirely brushed aside by Einstein. The idea that this was playing into something that was deeply, deeply oppressive was just not something that even occurred. And so America attempted to secure all uranium in the Congo. And what we had then, and we have similar things here, right? Deformities and illness as a consequence of working in the mine or living in the surrounding areas. And we see this with mining affected communities in this country till today. Also, neo-colonial corporations, mining corporations that are conducting similar efforts. But this is specifically to build the bomb. And so this is actually from a poem called Shinkolobwe Steer by a 14-year-old named Benina Mombilo, which is, when the predator took Africa's mines, he left behind death, poverty, conflict, and war. About the robbing of Africa of mineral resources for centuries. And the other one is Shinkolobwe has never been commemorated. The town is dead and is haunted by the ghost of Hiroshima. And that's Oliver Tsinyoka, who is a journalist who grew up close to Shinkolobwe. So this town of Shinkolobwe is, I think, really crucial in understanding, exactly how much the Europeans cared about, and in this case, the Americans cared about the people surrounding, who were inconveniently placed around their uranium deposits. So that's where they got the uranium from, and then the human impact of the bomb, which is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this is more common knowledge. 60,000 to 80,000 people were killed instantly when the uranium bomb was detonated over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Then the death toll raised to 140,000 people before the end of 1945 on account of the acute effects of the bomb. That's just Hiroshima. By the end of 1950, the death toll has reached approximately 200,000 people from cancer and other diseases linked to radiation poisoning. And then 75,000 people lost their lives in Nagasaki on the 9th of August when the plutonium bomb was dropped. And so obviously the idea that science exists separate from society, they are not even exaggerating mountains of corpses in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that can tell you otherwise. And I think that as scientists, that's something we very much need to keep in mind always, is how we can become tools or weapons to be wielded in the hands of an oppressive power. And so this is the opposition to nuclear weapons, so the ban the bomb. And this, what I kept here, what I put here, Arundhati Roy wrote in The End of Imagination, which she wrote in the 90s when India and Pakistan had very close to each other developed nuclear bombs. And in this case, she said, it is such supreme folly to believe that nuclear weapons are deadly only if they're used. The fact that they exist at all, their very presence in our lives, will wreak more havoc than we can begin to fathom. Nuclear weapons pervade our thinking, control our behavior, administer our society, inform our dreams. They bury themselves like meat hooks deep in the base of our brains. They are the purveyors of madness. They are the ultimate colonizer, whiter than any white man that ever lived, the very heart of whiteness. In another interview, Arundhati said that something along the lines of, we stormed the heart of whiteness and we took its most wretched creation, where, when India did it. And that very much, I believe, is the case concerning nuclear weapons. I think it is the most terrible, if not one of the most terrible, if not the most terrible creation that science, particularly I suppose my science, physics, has given the world. So that's, again, questions of these tendencies of colonialism and imperialism, the opposition to them. There's a couple of things to be spoken to on nuclear weapons, colonialism, and imperialism, but I'm not going to get too caught up in them. And so now bringing it back, right, to the Rhodes Statue, Rhodes Must Fall movement at UCT. And so 2015, the Rhodes Must Fall movement happens, right? The Rhodes Statue was still standing of Cecil John Rhodes. And this was an expression of rage against the public glorification of racist genocidal colonialists. And, the idea that it was 2015 and there was still a statue of Cecil John Rhodes is, in retrospect, mind-boggling. And, that's the thing about revolutionary breakthroughs in some sense. They always seem obvious in retrospect. But the Rhodes Must Fall movement formed part of the ideological and theoretical basis of the Fees Must Fall movement in 2015. And so in fighting colonialism, obviously in this country, it's not just about fighting statues, it's about fighting structures. And what we do have we have continuing cultures of white supremacy and institutionalized racism in our institutions of higher learning, but particularly at universities that were historically white. And so we have like UCT, WITS, UP, Stellenbosch, the university currently known as Rhodes. And Leicester speaks to that as well. The documentary, if comrades haven't watched it, we can circulate a link to that as well. I do think it's on YouTube. So this is obviously now bringing it back to us and engaging as the physicality of colonialism, which we have been doing since Rhodes Must Fall in 2015. And this just reiterates the need for a comprehensive decolonization project at our universities. And what exactly that means, I mean, more broadly, obviously is something that we have today, won't have much time to go into specifically, but there is one thing that I did want to bring to attention. And I think this is the problematization of the Harvard of Africa narrative, because particularly WITSEs have this thing, and UCT students, of considering the institution to be the Harvard of Africa. We are the elite university on the African continent. And this is problematic. So we know that science at historically white institutions like WITS and UCT is conducted within a space where the aspiration of institutional management is to duplicate the models of elite private institutions in the global north, like Harvard. And, so to go to Paulo Freire from the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, no pedagogy which is truly liberating can remain distinct from the oppressed by treating them as unfortunates and by presenting from their emulation models from amongst the oppressors. The oppressed must be their own example in the struggle for their redemption. And so, I mean, it's not very difficult to apply that to the situation of aspiring to become the Harvard of Africa. And so one is, firstly, an acknowledgement of historical material realities. We aren't an institution in the global north. We're not an institution inside of a colonizer country. We're an institution inside of a country that was formerly colonized. And it's impossible for us to maintain the same pedagogy in the context of that historical material reality. And so that's the first thing. And obviously the circumstances in the society in which our universities exist is not the same either. But then in terms of how our universities are run and what we mean by decolonization and how that would set us apart from these elite institutions like Harvard. And so I've written that decolonization of science and institutional design must include democratization, decorporatization, and decommodification as deeply linked to the project to decolonize. So just to speak to democratization, right, and decorporatization. So we know that the council is corporatized and unelected. We know that the council, the university council, is far more problematic, like the executive, than the Senate is. Just to give an example, when the academic boycott of Israel was adopted by the UCT Senate, the council refused to sign it and sent it back to Senate and was obstructing it. And I mean, we've had lots of experiences with council adverts. And so the idea is to transform more power from the unelected corporatized council to democratic bodies like the Senate, like the University Senate, which must have more student representation as one part of the decolonial project. The other part about decommodification is about decolonized education as a public good, which means that it's fee-free, that it's publicly funded, and it's in the commons. And then the last one is concerning the deepening of democracy on campus, especially in student politics, is about the establishment of a student parliament as a second arm of student representation and governance, which will deepen democracy on campus. It will also reinvigorate the political space, because I don't think that it is healthy democratically to have all students represented solely by the SRC. There are questions to be had about the SRC's electoral mandate and quorum, and not to say that the SRC is illegitimate necessarily, but to say that it is not sufficient as students for us to be represented by this one body alone, which can become very problematic, which can fail to lead students, and in those cases we do need other structures, we do need other branches of government. So I think that's also part of the project of decolonizing our institutions. And decolonizing science, obviously, like, you can't separate science from the institution in which science is being conducted. And in distinguishing ourselves from elite private institutions in the global north, I think these are crucial manners in which we should distinguish ourselves. And yeah, this is where I wanted to end, on the dual mission of decolonizing science. So that is Karl Marx's tomb, workers of all lands unite. But on his tombstone, he has this quote. If Comrade Newton is in this meeting, he'll tell me exactly where it's from. I can't remember. But the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, right? And so that's kind of the current that has been going through this whole thing. It's not just about interpreting colonization and science and then the decolonization of science, but directly and actively engaging the mission of decolonizing science in a concrete way, academically boycotting Israel, occupying the 30-meter telescope. Ban the bomb is a bit more difficult. I mean, people used to go chain themselves to nuclear sites and so on. I mean, that's another form of action. And obviously, roads must fall and fees must fall is us taking, what is the analysis of colonialism and very much using that analysis as the basis for action in decolonizing in a concrete way. And so obviously there are blind spots in what I went through today. I didn't, I also think I'm not doing very well for time. We did start late, but there's a lot to be built, but this was just about, setting the stage for what's coming later. We'll obviously look into other reading. That's why I said, like, the primary reading for today was Dr. Chandra Prescott Weinstein's list, because it does lay out a lot of important, lay out the project of decolonizing science quite well. So this was just the introduction. Next week, as we mentioned before, next week, Tuesday, the 8th, same time, we're going to be having an event on the academic boycott of apartheid Israel. And everyone is invited to attend. We're getting speakers and stuff at the moment. And yeah, I think on my side, that's my 2 cents. And yeah, I'd like to open to the floor. I'm very interested to see what everyone has to say.
Thank you very much. If anyone would like to comment, you can either use the chat box or unmute your mic. Yes, Sean, you can go.
Thank you so much. I don't want to take up too much space, but I figured if no one has something to say, maybe I'd get the ball rolling. This is a question for, I guess, for everybody, but for Rais as well. It sounds like a lot of what this is really a concern for humanities students, people who are interested in the sociology of science, the economics of science, the ethics of science, etc. But as somewhat of a practicing scientist myself now, we have a lot to catch up on. It doesn't seem as if this is altogether that important for when I do my actual experiments. Could you maybe say a bit more about why you think practicing scientists should have all of this other stuff in mind while they're doing their job?
If nobody else wants to come in, I'll respond to the way in the way I usually respond to students in the school who ask me, a similar question. And it's a ridiculous way to put it, but Comrade said to remember it. There's the scene in Iron Man 3 where Maya Hansen is speaking about how we all start out starry-eyed and wanting to do science for its own sake. And, we keep our head down, and one day we realize how far we've gone from shore. And she was speaking specifically in the context of, okay, I'm not going to go into the plot of Iron Man 3. The point, the example she gives, though, is Warner van Braun. And she says that when he was younger, an idealistic Warner van Braun dreamt of going to the stars. He was a stargazer. He was a maker of rockets. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to leave spaceship Earth and see the rest of the cosmos. But World War II comes around, and obviously the lead up to World War II, and Warner von Braun ends up being the chief weapons engineer of Adolf Hitler. And, keeping your head down. And so when he designs the V2 rockets, which go out into space before they hit their target, and they landed on London, he did say that they worked perfectly, but they landed on the wrong planet. And then obviously subsequent to that, you had Warner von Braun then being paperclipped, being taken on into the United States, became a huge part of the Apollo project, designed the Saturn V rocket, and then they got to the moon on account of it. And so there's this history with particularly Warner von Braun, but the point that was being made there is that we can very easily be co-opted if we keep our head down. And I think the point here is about not just restricting our critical thought to our scientific domain, because we see this a lot when we engage in these issues with students in the sciences. And I agree, like, these are very much humanities concerns, many of them, and I do think they interlock. But just I on the contrary to that, as in, like, the fact that these are humanities questions, I think that says more about the fact that it should be, this is my opinion, mandatory for science students to take humanities courses. I think it teaches you to think in a certain way. I think it also teaches you to engage critically with things that are outside of the laboratory. And I think that's crucial in genuinely, like, having a more holistic education as opposed to a technical skills training or something that is more along those lines. So yeah, I hope I addressed that in some way. I don't know if you want to come back in, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're in charge here. I don't want to overpower anybody else. Good points all round. But it just seems as if what you're really saying is that we should have a more holistic education, with which I agree. You know how much I've read, right? But that's not everyone's going to want to read that much, right? Some people go to university, I don't know, they want to become a chemist, they do what they need to do, and then they leave and get a job. It's the rare exception that likes to stay in the institution and get all this knowledge from history, sociology, in my case, biology. So, like there's a hope that everyone should get all this knowledge, but practically, I wonder if it really works.
Nkosazana, do you want to come in? Well, Nkosazana, you're cheering actually, so I don't know why you have your hand up.
It's just I didn't want to interrupt you.
Okay.
So from my opinion, right, with regards to this, I feel like all scientists need to have an understanding of how, how science can be misused. The problem with trying to separate humanities from science and separating everything as if this is one category and this is another category is that to a certain extent you'll feel like you aren't really responsible for whatever happens as a result of something that you were doing. So yes, it's fine that you're doing your experiments and everything, but think of the consequences towards humanity. The whole point of reading or everything and conscientizing yourself is not really that you're saying, again, like for the example of trying to decolonize gravity. No, it's a matter of being aware of the consequences of your actions as a scientist, because whatever it is that you do has repercussions to the rest of society in general, like as a whole, the rest of the world. Whatever you do, that's just my opinion on it. That's why, as a scientist, you need to be aware of how it has been used in the past, so that you don't repeat the same mistakes. I don't know if that sparks anything. Anyone has a reply to that?
I'm just going to jump in there as well. I agree with Nkosazana. Just with an example, I think. So in terms of when it comes to that, being aware of how we're being co-opted or how we can be co-opted, I think that requires you to be very, very aware of what the dominant status quo is, and what the circumstances surrounding the institution of higher learning and the use of knowledge is. And so you could, as a physicist who specializes in fluid dynamics, model for Raytheon the airflow surrounding a missile, and you can look at that as a purely technical problem, and you can use the Navier-Stokes equations, and you can have lots of fun just looking at it as an abstracted problem. But it isn't that to the people who are on the other side of it. It isn't that to the people who are being incinerated by those weapons. And so I think it's not just the question of, is it something we should do for our own self-enrichment? I think it's duty, because of the fact that if we don't do it, especially, and I suppose Sean is speaking more from the perspective of biology, and this is where we have a bit of a bias, and biology is definitely something that we need to engage more, and Dr. China Prescott-Weinstein has a similar bias to me in this case, because she's also an astrophysicist. Actually, she also studies dark matter. I think where we most significantly disagree is that she thinks dark matter, or she's researching chasing the lead of axions, and I'm chasing the lead of weakly interacting massive particles. But my point is that we both come from physics, and physics, I think, is very, very easily weaponized. And I think that's why physicists tend to be more acutely aware of this, because of, the Manhattan Project is not just part of the history of science, but part of the history of physics. And so it's something that obviously is a lot more pressing in terms of weaponization. And we also spoke, to astronomy in that sense, about making the slave trade more efficient. So I do think that the moment you stop engaging the world in which your science is conducted, then as a scientist you become a tool of the ruling order. I did want to make a point about corporatization, but I don't want to speak too much. I think communists should come in and I'm speaking too much. So yeah, I'm going to open the floor again.
Yes, Amara?
I just wanted to say, I think like in terms of the logistical parts of how to get more scientists involved in thinking about humanity, I think that's kind of the mission of decolonizing science and getting scientists involved in humanity questions and those kinds of things so that we can have achieved decolonized science.
Thank you so much, Raul.
So I don't want to add a lot, but it's very interesting because I'm just new to this whole topic and conversation. It was very broad and informative, but it was actually just yesterday, I think yesterday, the day before yesterday on my feed, to just sort of link back and how it's interesting that we can sort of, as scientists, try to bring this into conversation. Because I think it was Sean, if I can remember, so that yeah, most people just go to university, get this stuff, and won't care about these things. But I guess whoever's involved in the conversation, it's again kind of our responsibility to talk about it, you know, with other people in our field, and also those who are not in our field to just, you know, get the ball rolling of talking about. Because I was watching Neil deGrasse Tyson, astrophysicist, on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he was talking about Columbus and the misuse of knowledge in that sense of astronomy, of how he used, you know, the eclipse and all of these things against natives in that land, because I think they were sort of they had food rations that they only for the winter time that they only use for you know, they only make enough for themselves and they don't usually make extras or whatever. But Columbus just came aboard and he saw that he needed, you know, resources for people on his ship and everything, and he misused I think it was clips or something. So he told one of the chiefs or something of the tribe, saying that no, you know, if you don't give me your food rations, my God will make the moon, you know, blood red, and every single person will die unless you don't give me your food rations. And you know, being the universe as it is, obviously because of other factors, it turned red, and we know the science behind it, but natives at that time don't know, you know, why. It's just sort of common to them that this will happen and so forth. So that misuse of knowledge, I guess, is how some people have the upper hand against others. So very intuitive. So that's just my 2 cents. But yeah, very interesting.
Thank you very much. Harry, you can go next.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. Just some questions that come to mind. I just a disclaimer, I'm not a scientist. I'm actually a philosopher and epistemologist from UWC, so I'm not even from WITS, but I'm very interested in the conversation. And I think it raises some interesting questions because the discussions and debates in analytic philosophy, which is a school of thought that is found in the United States, South Africa, England, and Australia, which likes to think of philosophy through argument and logic, tries to model itself around science often. And so there's a lot of interplay there. And yeah. So there's a question that I would like to pose to Raiz around when science or scientific institutions or scientific thinkers deem other forms of knowledge or putative knowledge systems as pseudoscientific or non-scientific, thereby, you know, denying access to particular or other ideas or conceptions of reality and ways of examining reality. And one can think of, in the South African context, the 1957 Suppression of Witchcraft Act that was put into place, which kind of codified that legally. But also just in general, when herbalists and other kinds of traditional practitioners try to come to the fore and discuss different remedies that are, say, perhaps at ends or at odds, or perhaps not yet studied or verified by the scientific community, that is, of course, usually dismissed. And so there's a certain kind of cynicism already at a prior level. So how can decolonization then come about when there is the cynicism about what's going on in the periphery, right? Because there's this core, and then there's the periphery where everybody else, just is, and where all of these other systems of knowledge are going to be defined as putative systems, right? And then I think, there's another question and it speaks to, I think, the point that was made by Sean, and also the point made by Raiz around, students that are going into university, learning science, and then perhaps having a humanities course, and, to broaden their understanding and perspective. But I wonder if co-option is just by design, as it were, that, the way that one goes about their activity, perhaps, or their academic practice is designed in such a way that, like Sean says, you don't need to be interested in these kinds of things because they really go against output. If you are considering these things at a prior stage, perhaps you won't be able to produce your scientific output. And yeah, I think of a philosopher in the experimental philosophy field. His name is Eduardo Majori, and he published a book called Philosophy Within Its Proper Bounds. And he makes this argument, about what philosophers tend to argue, that, for example, doing moral philosophy makes you a better human being. And he gives this very interesting example about moral philosophers being actually recorded to return their library books late, at whatever university, at whatever study. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. But the point is that with that moral knowledge, you can actually, subvert the system, given that you are not only equipped with the power to understand what the normative standards are, but you are also able to produce particular kinds of information, data, or whatever, that may be able to work in line with that. So I'm wondering, how do we talk of decolonization from an African indigenous perspective when already at a prior stage, everything that might be presented, right, may not have a foundation? Yeah, so that was my point.
Thank you very much. Kamais, I hope you're noting some of these down. I'm just going to continue with the hands, and then you'll just give us what is your last comment, because I'm just checking the time. Linda, you can go.
Hi, everyone. My comment was more linked to what Sean was saying. So I agree with everyone that we also have a responsibility as scientists to do, I mean, in quotes, the right thing. But I also think that looking at things from more of a sociological, or what we're saying here, more from a humanities view, also makes us better scientists. I mean, we are able to look at our information in a more critical way. We're also able to give reasons to why things are the way that they are. So it's not only a link of, as an activist, I need to be better, but it's also, as a scientist, I need to look at information in a different way. I need to look at the way things have developed in a different way, so I can make my conclusions with more educated conclusions.
Harry, please mute your mic.
Sorry.
Yes, Linda, continue.
Oh, no, that was what I was saying. That's everything. Thanks.
Alright, and then our last hand before Rais gives feedback. Can we have Muzamil?
Hi everyone. I just want to respond to Sean's concern about the practicalities of bringing in humanities courses in the science faculty, because like you said, many people want to come into university, get their technical skills, leave and get a job. So I just want to speak from a health sciences student perspective. I'm a first year medical student. And I just want to say that humanities courses in the health sciences faculty isn't an outlandish thing. In fact, it actually exists already. So first year medical students already do sociology, philosophy of medicine, and I think in third year we do ethics. So these platforms already exist. So I do think it can be expanded upon. So it's not a question of practicality, like I said, because they exist already, but we can definitely bring in the history and misuse of medicine into these causes. So for example, we can speak about the HeLa cells. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with that, but it comes from an African American woman whose cancerous cells were taken from her without her consent, and HeLa cells actually survive indefinitely. They reproduce indefinitely, and they're used in various medical research projects across the world. So we can bring in topics like that, as well as more topical ones like vaccine nationalism and vaccine apartheid. So I do think that practicality isn't really a problem. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks so much.
Right. Thank you so much. So just before Comrade comes in with closing statements, answering certain questions and everything else, I just want to say, oh, okay, just one last time. Sorry, I'm just checking the time. Amara?
Sorry, I just wanted to agree with what Linda was saying about science being so important in humanities, especially like what scientists choose to discover. If they were more aware of humanities and issues surrounding the world, then it can shape what they scientific discoveries that they do make. So that's just me agreeing with Linda.
All right, thank you. I think, yes, thank you everyone for coming. Again, like I said, Comrade is still going to come in, but thank you for taking the time. I hope you did learn something today. Comrade, you can come in with your closing statement.
Thanks, Susanna. Just to start off, I've put the link to the Aloha Hyena Support Fund for the Kiai who are fighting the infringement of the sovereignty of their land by the construction of the 30-meter telescope. I've put the link to the donation page in the chat box. Please do donate. Please do circulate. Just at the outset, and then to get to the questions. So to start with so-called non-scientific modes of knowledge, I did say earlier that, you know, science is a sort of grand and powerful epistemic tradition, undeniably. But the thing is that I think the moment we start making claims to the totality of knowledge and being able to probe that through strictly the scientific method, we lose the plot somewhat. And I do think that there are other means. So it's a question of, I suppose, what we're studying as well, right? When it comes to, just to bring it back to physics, just because that's where I'm from, you know, when it comes to getting knowledge about the structure of the atom or getting knowledge about the structure of galaxies and so on, I don't think personally there is an alternative to the scientific method. But obviously, as we go into studying other parts of society, studying other domains of knowledge, it's not as easy anymore to conduct scientific research, you know, thoroughly in terms of the scientific method, and especially where things aren't easy to quantify. And so I want to speak to a couple of things quickly on that. The one thing that I want to speak to, which we may or may not be able to have a discussion on, is psychiatry, which I think is an extension of, or is an attempt, and you know, this is obviously a discussion and a debate for another day, but is, I think, an attempt to fit something that is far more complex than what can be grasped by, you know, a simplistic sort of application of the scientific method. It tries to understand the human psyche through those means alone, and I think falls short of the mark because of that. I don't think it's possible to understand the human psyche without also understanding psychology. And you know, and we can speak about, you know, neuroscience, neurology, psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis. This is a whole different discussion, but which I think we should have. So that's the one point I wanted to make concerning the limitations of scientific epistemology. The other one was indigenous knowledge systems. So I'm going to speak about this in two contexts. Well, firstly, I don't think we have time now to address the question of quote unquote witchcraft. Because I do think, I mean, this is when you look at the question of quote unquote witchcraft, it's a lot of this is not about, you know, people saying they're going to send lightning for other people and stuff. If we look at the issues, it is particularly old Black women in like specific rural areas. I know I did go to an art exhibition by, I can't remember the artist's name, about this, but who are being murdered and accusation of so-called witchcraft. So there's a whole discussion to be had there about witchcraft and you know, breaking that down as to what is seen as witchcraft and what isn't. But I think the more clear one is indigenous medicine. So I think the points that Muzammil made are really, really good concerning medicine. And I definitely think, I mean, we have a very dirty history in medicine, even at WITS specifically. And I think that definitely one of our sessions should be on that in the second semester. In understanding that, and indigenous medicine, I think, is crucial in understanding a lot. And you know, the idea that Western medicine, quote unquote Western medicine, I don't entirely agree with that point, but with that terminology, but that there are limitations and that there is something to be learned from indigenous knowledge systems, from indigenous medicine. Obviously, the question of vaccines is also an important one, right, in the decolonial project, because it's not just, you know, the preference of so-called Western medicine over indigenous medicine, but it's also when, like, modern scientific medicine is denied to people, like we were speaking about vaccine apartheid, on account of factors of colonialism. So that's definitely something I think we should speak more into. Concerning, again, going back to indigenous knowledge systems and the limitations of, you know, what is traditionally considered a scientific body of knowledge, in addressing the climate crisis, in addressing the hunger crisis in particular, indigenous knowledge and indigenous methods of farming and so on are crucial, especially when we're looking at issues of decentralizing the food system in the context of food sovereignty, which goes deeper than just food security, agroecology, and so on. There's a lot to be gained from indigenous knowledge systems. And so it would be foolish for us to dismiss that as well. So that was indigenous knowledge systems concerning medicine. There was one other thing that I wanted to bring in concerning this. I agree entirely with the point that it does make us better scientists, actually, to engage the humanities. I did say that it does teach you to think in a different way. And we did obviously address the question of becoming a tool or a weapon. So going forward, there's a lot to speak about. And I really think that this first discussion was quite productive, and I look forward to the future sessions where obviously we can deal with these issues in a lot more depth, and you know, we'll have specific readings and we'll like closely deal with the readings, and in sort of formulating and actualizing a pedagogy of the oppressed. But so just to brief everyone going forward, I've said it before, next week is academic boycott of Israel, and then we will have more information for everyone afterwards. But it is Pride Month, and there will be a queer liberation event, some sort of queer liberation event that WSPS is hosting, that we will partner with them to host in the context of decolonizing science. You know, it's important to acknowledge that the homophobic laws that are on the books on the African continent were put there by colonialists, and so that's an important discussion to be had as well. So that's what's happening over the course of the next, from now until the end of the semester. At some point, we will hit the wall of moratorium, and then we'll come back in the second semester. Just in dealing with and I'll end on this, the second semester. We will then have a lot more space, and obviously this is open, and anybody who is here who wants to be added to the WhatsApp group can you could just, I don't know what we should do. Nkosazana, do you want them to send you their number directly, or just so that we can populate this WhatsApp group, and it's a lot easier than to circulate things, and obviously for this conversation to continue afterwards. Just because primarily here, and I suppose there is some other means through which you can communicate this to us, but the point is that it's open now going into the second semester on which aspects of decoloniality we look at. So I think specifically the one that was brought up today about medicine is definitely one we should engage. There is, on the points that I was making concerning the Manhattan Project, there was a full presentation that I gave in 2019 with the Decolonization of Science Reading Club called Rethinking the Giants of the Scientific Domain. And it was about colonialism, imperialism, and the Cold War in the context of the Manhattan Project. That's on the share drive as well, will be circulated as well. I think that gives some perspective into what I said about the Manhattan Project today. So that can be circulated as well. I don't know if we do that one again, but just definitely the issue of medicine. We can speak about the issue of psychiatry. We can speak about Fanon and Pico when we do. And I think definitely patriarchy in STEM, like that's a huge one, needs to be addressed. Then I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. But anyway, the point is that this is open going forward in terms of where comrades want us to engage. You know, we're open to suggestions on readings on particular topics, but we're also open to suggestions on what topics we should engage. So on that, I think I'd like to close. It is. Yeah, I think we have been going on for quite a while. Just a reminder of the stuff on the Aloha Hyena Support Fund. And yeah, I look forward to continuing this discussion. I think it's a really crucial one. I think it's great that we're having it. I think engaging with some of the people here that I haven't seen in a long time was great. And I hope everyone keeps coming to the sessions. I hope we keep growing this discussion, you know, getting more academics in, getting more people outside of WITS in, you know, getting more workers in, and we need to speak about that, about how we make this accessible. And so there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm quite excited, if I'm honest. You know, I was really excited when this first started, and COVID kind of derailed it in 2020. And I think now we actually have a far more solid basis. And I think what is crucial now is that we're dealing with the question again of free, equality, decolonized education. And so these questions of what does it mean to decolonize our institution, our discipline, our society have come to the fore again. And so now there's this pressing need to make sense of all of this, especially in the context of these bad faith caricatures of what decoloniality means specifically in science. And so right now, I think we're in a specific situation. I think Nkosazana is cheering me for going on for too long. But just to finish, we're in a specific situation where it is especially important for us to engage this discourse and the consequent action. We can't leave that out. And I look forward to keep doing this in future sessions with everyone. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. And I will see you all next week. We will keep everyone up to date on exactly what's going on there and circulate all of the resources ASAP. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks very much for
Am I
this.
safe to stay on the channel?
Sorry, I
you.
just want to say goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye, Sean.
Okay, Saeed.
Yeah. Is it still recording?
Okay. It's still recording. It's just a matter of I want to make sure that this recording doesn't disappear because it has a habit of doing that. So I'm going to stop the recording and then hopefully, unless, does it show on your side that you can stop the recording?
It doesn't allow me to stop the recording, but I think once the recording is stopped and saved, it will allow me to download it.
Okay, I'll do that now.